Before Benito Mussolini became one of history's most notorious dictators, he made a promise to the Italian people: order, greatness, and a new Roman Empire. What he delivered instead was a system of terror so methodical, so deliberate in its cruelty, that even his own allies eventually turned away in horror. The methods he used to silence his enemies were not simply acts of war, they were performances. And what happened in the final days of his regime would shock the world in ways that still reverberate today. To understand how Mussolini killed, you first have to understand how he controlled. When he seized full dictatorial power in 1925, he did not immediately resort to open slaughter. That was not his style, at least not yet. Instead, he constructed one of the most sophisticated surveillance and enforcement systems in European history, the OVRA, his secret political police. The name itself was deliberately mysterious. Mussolini never gave an official explanation for what the acronym stood for, and historians have debated it ever since. Some believe it derived from a word meaning octopus, a creature that reaches into every corner. Whether intentional or not, the image was accurate. The OVRA had informants embedded in neighborhoods, workplaces, trade unions, and even churches. Nobody could be entirely certain who was watching or who had already reported them. For those the OVRA marked as threats, the first punishment was not death. It was confinement. Mussolini created a system called confino, or internal exile, where political opponents were forcibly relocated to remote villages in southern Italy, or isolated islands such as Lipari, Ponza, and Ventotene. These were not prisons in the traditional sense. There were no walls, but those sent there were cut off from their families, stripped of their livelihoods, and watched at all times. The psychological weight of that isolation destroyed many men long before any physical harm reached them. The confino system was also designed to break people gradually. Those exiled to the islands were given a small daily allowance, barely enough to survive on, and were required to present themselves to local authorities each morning. They were forbidden from leaving the assigned commune, forbidden from communicating freely with the press, and watched by local carabinieri, who filed regular reports on their behavior, their conversations, and their state of mind. For men who had been politicians, lawyers, or union leaders, the reduction to that kind of dependent, monitored existence was its own form of destruction. For those deemed more dangerous, those who organized, published underground newspapers, or attempted to build resistance, the fate was considerably harsher. The Special Tribunal for the Defense of the State, established in 1926, had the power to sentence political prisoners to death. It operated entirely outside the normal Italian judicial system. There were no juries, verdicts were delivered by military judges, and crucially, the tribunal answered not to the courts, but directly to the regime. One of the most prominent victims of this apparatus was Antonio Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party. Arrested in 1926, Gramsci was tried before the Special Tribunal and sentenced to over 20 years in prison. The prosecutor at his trial stated plainly that they needed to stop his brain from working for 20 years. Gramsci spent most of his imprisonment in deteriorating health, denied adequate medical care, and died in 1937, just days after his conditional release, never having truly recovered his freedom. The OVRA and the Special Tribunal were efficient and cold instruments of control, but they were not Mussolini's most brutal. For that, we need to look at what happened when the regime felt genuinely threatened, and when the methods moved from isolation and imprisonment into something far more final. Long before Mussolini held formal state power, his movement had already developed its preferred instrument of violence: the black shirts, known in Italian as the squadrismo. These were paramilitary gangs, largely composed of disillusioned World War I veterans, who operated in the early 1920s with near complete impunity. Their mission was not subtle. They targeted trade union organizers, socialist politicians, journalists, and anyone else who represented opposition to the fascist movement's rise. The black shirts' methods were calculated to humiliate as much as to harm. One of their most notorious practices was forcing opponents to consume large quantities of castor oil, sometimes at gunpoint. The substance taken in such doses causes severe and prolonged gastrointestinal distress, a deeply degrading experience that left victims weakened, disoriented, and publicly shamed. The goal was to strip the dignity of political opponents in front of their communities, turning them into objects of mockery rather than figures of resistance. This was not random mob violence, it was organized. Squads arrived in trucks, coordinated with local fascist leaders, and targeted specific individuals with prepared lists in hand. When they were done, they left. Local authorities, many of whom were sympathetic to fascism or simply too frightened to intervene, rarely pressed charges. The Italian state, still nominally a constitutional monarchy at this point, looked away. The beatings that accompanied these raids were often severe enough to cause permanent injury. Some victims were left for dead on roadsides. Others survived only to find that no hospital, no lawyer, and no authority would assist them, because anyone who aided a known anti-fascist risked becoming the next name on the list. The murder of Giacomo Matteotti in 1924 stands as the defining atrocity of this early period. Matteotti was a prominent socialist member of parliament who had publicly challenged the results of the 1924 election, methodically documenting fascist fraud and intimidation in a speech before the Chamber of Deputies. He was a careful, courageous man who understood exactly the risk he was taking. Days after that speech, he was abducted from a Rome street in broad daylight, stabbed repeatedly, and his body was concealed in a shallow grave outside the city, where it remained undiscovered for 2 months. The murder caused a national outcry. For a brief moment, it appeared that it might bring down Mussolini's government entirely. International press condemned it. Opposition politicians walked out of parliament in protest. A move known as the Aventine Secession. Catholic voices, liberal voices, and moderate conservatives all expressed shock and dismay. But the outrage had no mechanism to convert itself into action. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, declined to intervene. The military did not move. The opposition, having walked out of parliament, found itself with no institutional lever left to pull. Mussolini survived. He consolidated power, intimidated opponents one by one, and eventually turned the crisis into an opportunity. By January 1925, he stood before parliament and openly acknowledged responsibility for the political climate that produced Matteotti's death, daring his opponents to act against him. None did. Within weeks, he had dissolved independent political parties, shut down opposition newspapers, and replaced elected local governments with officials appointed directly by Rome. The constitutional machinery that might have stopped him was quietly dismantled piece by piece, and each piece was removed without a single shot being fired. What the Matteotti murder demonstrated was a pattern that would repeat itself across the entire Mussolini era. Open, brazen violence followed by institutional paralysis, followed by further consolidation of power. The bodies were not incidental to this process. They were messages, and the message was always the same, that the regime could act without consequence. When most people think of Mussolini's crimes, they think of his alliance with Hitler, the persecution of Italian Jews, and the final chaos of the war years. Far fewer know what his regime did in Africa. And the scale of what happened there is staggering. Italy had controlled Libya since 1911, but by the 1920s, a sustained resistance movement led by the Senussi order was still challenging Italian authority in the eastern region of Cyrenaica. The man Mussolini sent to crush that resistance, and later the general who would become the defining face of colonial brutality under fascism, was Rodolfo Graziani. Graziani's campaign against the Libyan resistance, and particularly against its leader, Omar Mukhtar, became one of the most thoroughly documented examples of systematic colonial atrocity in the 20th century. Beginning in 1930, the Italian military began forcibly relocating the entire civilian population of the Jebel Akhdar region, tens of thousands of people, into concentration camps in the coastal lowlands. The stated purpose was to sever the resistance movement from its base of supply and civilian support. The actual result was mass death. The camps were placed in inhospitable terrain. Food, water, and medical facilities were wholly inadequate. Disease, starvation, and exposure took lives in enormous numbers. Historians estimate that between 1930 and 1932, the population of Cyrenaica dropped by roughly half, from approximately 225,000 to around 142,000. Total death tolls across Italy's broader pacification campaigns in Libya have been estimated at over 100,000 people. To cut off supply lines and block fighters from crossing into Egypt, the Italians constructed a 300-kilometer barbed wire barrier stretching from the Mediterranean coast all the way to the edge of the Sahara, one of the longest military barriers of its kind in history at that time. It was patrolled continuously by camel-mounted troops and aerial surveillance. Those caught attempting to cross were shot on sight. The barrier's effect on the civilian population of Cyrenaica was catastrophic. It severed not just military supply routes, but traditional grazing lands, migration paths, and trade connections that communities had depended on for generations. Families that had survived on livestock found their herds unable to cross to seasonal pastures. The economic destruction was total, and it preceded any military action by weeks in some areas. Italian forces also made extensive use of aerial bombardment against civilian and resistance targets, and, critically, the documented use of mustard gas, a chemical weapon banned under international conventions that Italy had itself signed. The gas was not reserved as a weapon of last resort. It was deployed routinely against villages and encampments, killing in ways that were slow, agonizing, and impossible to treat in a desert environment with no medical infrastructure. Omar Mukhtar was finally captured in September 1931. He was in his 60s by then, wounded, exhausted, and caught after years of evading a vastly better equipped military force. His trial before an Italian military court lasted a single day. He was found guilty of armed resistance and sentenced to death. On September 16, 1931, he was publicly hanged at the Suluk concentration camp in front of thousands of Libyan prisoners who had been forced to assemble and watch. The Italians intended the execution as a final statement, a demonstration that resistance had been conclusively defeated. The deliberate theater of that hanging, the forced audience, the public location, the spectacle of it, captures something essential about how Mussolini's regime understood the function of execution. It was never purely administrative. It was always, to some degree, a performance of power, and that instinct, to turn killing into a statement, would find its most extreme expression on an entirely different continent just 4 years later. In October 1935, Mussolini launched his invasion of Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia, in open defiance of the League of Nations and international opinion. The campaign was presented to the Italian public as a reclamation of Roman greatness, the dawn of a new empire. For the people of Ethiopia, it was a war conducted with modern industrial weapons against an army that, in many areas, still fought with outdated rifles and traditional arms. Ethiopia fell by May 1936, but the methods used to achieve that conquest were not those of conventional military victory. They were those of deliberate extermination. Mustard gas and phosgene, chemical agents explicitly banned under the 1925 Geneva Protocol, were deployed on a massive scale by the Italian Air Force. They were dropped not only on Ethiopian military formations, but on Red Cross medical facilities, civilian convoys, and villages with no military significance. Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie appeared before the League of Nations in Geneva in June 1936 and described in specific detail the nature of the attacks, the chemical clouds settling over villages, the burns covering the skin of children, the deaths that followed over days. The League passed resolutions. No action followed. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, commanding the Northern Front, authorized gas attacks as a routine element of military policy. Graziani, in the south, did the same. Entire towns were leveled in aerial bombardment campaigns. Villages suspected of sheltering resistance fighters were burned to the ground. Prisoners captured during the campaign were frequently executed without any form of trial. The most concentrated episode of mass killing came in February 1937, following an assassination attempt on Graziani in Addis Ababa. 2 young Ethiopians threw grenades at Graziani during a public ceremony. He survived, though wounded. What followed were 3 days of organized killing throughout the city and its surroundings. Italian soldiers and black shirt militia moved through Ethiopian neighborhoods without restraint. Homes were set on fire. Civilians were killed in their streets. Estimates of those killed in those 3 days range from several hundred to several thousand, and the violence then extended outward into the countryside for weeks. Religious sites connected to Ethiopian national identity became particular targets. The ancient monastery of Debre Libanos, one of the most sacred locations in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, with a history stretching back to the 5th century, was the site of a massacre in May 1937. Several hundred monks, deacons, and pilgrims were executed on Graziani's direct orders, based on his assertion that the monastery's leadership had been connected to the resistance. The monks were marched out and shot in groups. Deacons, many of them young men in religious training, were killed alongside them. The monastery itself was severely damaged. What made the massacre particularly significant was not only its scale, but its target. Debre Libanos was not a military installation. It was a place of prayer and learning that had stood for over 1,000 years. Its destruction sent a message that the Italian occupation was prepared to destroy the very foundations of Ethiopian civilization, not merely its political resistance. None of the commanders responsible, not Badoglio, not Graziani, not the officers who carried out their instructions, were ever brought before an international tribunal for what happened in Ethiopia. Graziani was imprisoned briefly after the war, not for his actions in Africa, but for his later collaboration with Nazi Germany during the Italian Social Republic. He was released in 1950 and died in 1955. In 2012, a monument erected in his honor in his hometown of Afile generated international condemnation before being removed under court order. The impunity those men enjoyed was not accidental. It was built into the structure of a regime that had spent 2 decades insulating itself from any form of external accountability. And that insulation held, even as the regime itself began to collapse from within. By September 1943, Mussolini was a diminished figure. Arrested by the Italian king in July of that year, following a vote by his own fascist Grand Council to remove him from power, he had spent weeks in custody at a series of remote locations before German commandos, acting on Hitler's direct orders, carried out a raid and freed him. He was then installed as the head of a German-backed puppet state in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic, headquartered at Salo on the shore of Lake Garda. This government, entirely dependent on German military support for its survival, was in many respects the most extreme form Italian fascism ever took. Stripped of its earlier claims to empire and respectability, it functioned as a regime of pure enforcement, collaborating with the Nazi SS in the identification, roundup, and deportation of Italian Jews, and conducting increasingly savage counterinsurgency campaigns against the Italian partisan movement that was growing in the mountains and towns of the north. The partisans, men and women drawn from across the political spectrum, united by their opposition to both fascism and the German occupation, presented a serious and expanding threat to what remained of Mussolini's authority. The Salo Republic's response was to treat captured partisans not as prisoners of war, but as criminals subject to immediate execution. Detainees were frequently subjected to prolonged interrogation under extreme duress before being killed. Their bodies were left in public view, hung from lampposts, displayed in piazzas, as explicit warnings to the surrounding population. In some towns, the bodies were left for days, and locales were forbidden from removing them or paying any form of last respects. In the countryside, entire villages suspected of providing shelter, food, or information to partisan bands were subjected to collective punishment. Homes were burned. Male residents of a certain age were rounded up and shot without individual investigation. The Salo Republic's militia forces and the German SS operated in close coordination, with the Italians often providing local knowledge and the Germans providing the firepower to carry out larger operations. Within the regime itself, Mussolini also moved against those he had now identified as traitors. In January 1944 at Verona, 5 members of the fascist Grand Council, who had voted to remove him from power the previous July, were put on trial for treason. The outcome was never in doubt. All 5 were convicted and sentenced to death. They were executed by firing squad on January 11, 1944. Among those shot at Verona was Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's own son-in-law, husband to his daughter, Etta. Mussolini reviewed the sentences and signed off on the executions. Etta made desperate attempts to intervene, including efforts to use private diaries she had taken out of the country as leverage for her husband's life. Nothing she did was sufficient. Ciano was killed alongside the others, and Mussolini's daughter never forgave her father. The two never spoke again. The execution of Ciano is significant not only for the personal dimension it carries, but for what it reveals about where Mussolini had arrived by 1944. Personal loyalty. family connection, 2 decades of shared history. None of it had any weight against the logic of political survival that governed every decision he made in those final years. As 1944 progressed and Allied forces continued their northward advance through the Italian peninsula, the violence inside the Salo Republic intensified. German reprisal operations and Italian fascist militia actions against civilian populations escalated in ferocity. The Marzabotto massacre of October 1944, carried out by German SS units of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division with the involvement of Italian fascist forces, resulted in the deaths of more than 770 civilians across several villages in the Apennine Mountains south of Bologna. The killings took place over 4 days, from September 29th to October 5th, 1944. Soldiers moved from house to house, from field to field. They entered churches where civilians had gathered seeking shelter and killed those inside. Among the dead were women, elderly residents, and children, including infants. No partisan military activity was taking place in the immediate area at the time. The operation was a reprisal in name only. In practice, it was the systematic elimination of an entire civilian community. Marzabotto remains one of the worst atrocities committed on Italian soil during the entire war, and the officer who commanded the operation, Walter Retter, was convicted of war crimes by an Italian military tribunal in 1951. By late April 1945, the war in Italy was functionally over. Allied forces were closing in from the south, and partisan uprisings had erupted across the towns and cities of the north. Mussolini, by then visibly aged beyond his years, had spent his final weeks in a state of near paralysis at Lake Como, oscillating between plans to flee and plans to negotiate, acting on neither. On April 25, 1945, he joined a German military convoy moving northwest along the lake's western shore, heading in the direction of the Swiss border. The convoy was halted at a partisan roadblock near the town of Dongo. When partisans began searching the German vehicles, Mussolini was discovered among the soldiers, wearing a German military overcoat in an attempt to conceal himself. He was recognized and taken into partisan custody. He was held in a farmhouse in the small village of Giulino di Mezzegra near Azzano. On April 28, 1945, he was shot, along with his companion Clara Petacci, who was killed beside him. The partisan commander who carried out the execution has been identified as Luigi Longo in some accounts and Walter Audizio in others, and the precise circumstances of those final hours have been the subject of historical dispute ever since. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Mussolini was dead at 61 years old, killed not by an army, not by an Allied tribunal, but by the same kind of irregular fighters his regime had spent years hunting down and executing. The bodies were then transported overnight to Milan. In the early morning hours of April 29th, they were hung upside down from the roof of a petrol station on the Piazzale Loreto, the same square where, less than a year earlier, the bodies of 15 executed Italian partisans had been put on public display by fascist forces. The choice of that specific location was deliberate. It was a reversal, a reclaiming of a place the regime had made into a site of intimidation. The scene that gathered over the following hours was enormous. Thousands of Milanese citizens came to the Piazzale. Some came out of fury accumulated over 20 years. Some came simply because they could not believe it until they saw it. The photographs taken that day, and there were many, circulated internationally within days. For much of the world, those images marked the end of Italian fascism more viscerally than any official announcement or military communique could have. Allied authorities eventually ordered the bodies to be taken down. Mussolini and Petacci were removed from public display and buried in unmarked graves. In 1957, following years of legal proceedings, Mussolini's remains were returned to his hometown of Predappio in Emilia-Romagna and placed in the family crypt, where they remain to this day, still a site of organized pilgrimage for far-right movements from across Europe. What connects every method Mussolini employed, from the OVRA's quiet eliminations to the chemical attacks over Ethiopia, from the black shirt squads to the Verona executions, is a single consistent logic. Violence was always a tool in service of something else, Every execution, every massacre, every body left in a public space was meant to communicate something to those who remained alive. Fear, finality, the cost of resistance. That logic produced its own moral ecosystem. The men who carried out Mussolini's orders in Libya and Ethiopia did so with official authorization, with promotions, and with public honors. Graziani was celebrated as a national hero of empire. Badoglio, who had authorized chemical attacks against civilian populations in 2 separate African campaigns, was appointed Prime Minister of Italy after Mussolini's fall, a position he held until June 1944. The machinery of accountability that might have addressed these crimes simply did not materialize in the post-war Italian context. The needs of reconstruction, the pressures of the early Cold War, and the political desire for national reconciliation all worked against a full reckoning. The Nuremberg trials established international frameworks for prosecuting leaders who directed war crimes and crimes against humanity. No equivalent process was ever applied to Italy's colonial record. The men responsible for Ethiopia and Libya were not, in the main, called to account before any international body. The crimes they committed remained for decades largely absent from Italian school curricula and public memory. What remains then is the historical record, the documents, the aerial photographs, the survivor testimonies, the decades of scholarship produced by historians in Italy, Ethiopia, Libya, and beyond. That record makes clear, without ambiguity, that Mussolini's Italy was not the softer or more humane face of European fascism that post-war apologists sometimes suggested. It was a system fully capable of extraordinary, sustained, and methodical cruelty. It developed that capacity before the war began, practiced it in Africa throughout the 1930s, and brought it back to Italian soil in the final 2 years of the regime's life. The methods Mussolini used did not emerge all at once. They grew, adapted, and escalated over the course of 2 decades. Each step made the next one easier. Each atrocity that went unanswered widened the range of what the regime believed it could do and survive. The arc from castor oil to concentration camps, from internal exile to chemical warfare, from domestic repression to mass execution, that arc is not a historical accident. It is the shape that unchecked political violence tends to take when it is given enough time, enough institutional cover, and enough silence from those positioned to challenge it. The silence of institutions, the Italian monarchy, the Catholic Church in its early accommodation of fascism, the League of Nations that condemned and then did nothing, was not passive. It was a form of permission. And the men who exercised that permission understood it as such. They knew they were being watched. They knew what they were doing was documented. They proceeded anyway because the watching had no consequences. That is the lesson the historical record of Mussolini's regime keeps returning to, across every theater and every method. The machinery of atrocity does not require monsters in every position. It requires ordinary institutional failure at a sufficient number of critical moments. The OVRA worked because informants were ordinary people. The black shirt squads operated because local police were ordinary men who stood aside. The massacres in Ethiopia and Libya were carried out by soldiers following orders in a command structure, staffed at every level by people who had careers and families and went home afterward. Understanding that is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is the accurate one. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.